Hi. I have an easy question for everybody. Who here has ever made pancakes? Raise your show of hands. Very good. Okay. What do you do with those pancakes when they're halfway done? Anybody? Flip them over. You flip them over. And what do you use to flip them over other than subtle pan and wrist action? Spatula.
Pancake turner.
Very good. Do you call it a spatula? Who here calls it a turner? Somebody call it a turner. We have a turner, a couple of turners. Anybody call it a flipper? Some people call them flippers. This was an interesting question to me because for a few years I worked at SKILLET on the digital team. I was the content strategist and basically UX team of one. They, if you are not familiar with SKILLET, sell fancy cooking gear. They are currently in the Pearl District in Lake Oswego if you want to swing by. They are not paying me to tell you this because I don't work there anymore since moving down here. They're a very nice store nonetheless. And this is my information in case you need it for Twitter or anything else. Just to throw that in there. But at SKILLET, we called those turners because the people that made them and gave them to us to sell to people tended to call them turners. But customers actually call them all three of those things. Spatulas, as we saw, almost everybody here calls them a spatula. Turners, even some flippers. But the the biggest one is a spatula. Almost everybody calls it, it's like, by a lot of statistics, I've done show of hands on this question a lot of times, and it's usually at least 3/4 of any given audience will call it a spatula, and a few people will call it a turner or a flipper. Internal search data was kind of the same way. At Confab, it was weird, like 2 people did not call it a spatula, which apparently either going back to the Midwest meant that that was what people did, or or it was just a weird crowd, but a good weird crowd because I call it a spatula too. But when we used spatula at SKILLET and said, hey, if you're looking for spatulas, here are some spatulas, this is what we would show you. Because of course, customers also call that a spatula because I would call that a spatula. I think almost everybody that I know. You could call it a bowl scraper. Apparently there are a few rogue individuals out there, but pretty much a spatula. But that makes an interesting challenge for e-commerce in particular, especially when people are coming to your site, because when somebody says, I'm coming to your site to look for a spatula, well, what do they want? It's not the kind of thing that gets confusing in real life. It's if you're cooking pancakes or hamburgers and you say, hand me the spatula, you're not going to get a bowl scraper. And if you are doing cupcakes or something that's got a big batter and you say, hand me the spatula, people are not going to be sending you the flipper. But it was an interesting question for us, especially when I started, because we used to keep spatulas and turners in separate categories entirely. They all lived under this giant category called cook stools, so they were not completely separate. But if you went browsing around the site, one page would take you to spatulas, one page would take you to turners. And this was not a unique problem. There were many things, especially when you're selling cooking stuff or anything like that, that have multiple terms that multiple people use. Does anybody know what you would call this fine Le Creuset object? How many would call it a Dutch oven? As most people do. Less commonly, people call it a French oven. Does anybody think of them that way? You know who really likes to call it a French oven, or at least did at the time, was Le Creuset, because they are French, and they sold French ovens. That the biggest distinction was that they were made by Le Creuset, and they were French. So otherwise, functioned exactly the same kind of capacity, same sort of stuff that you would get from other manufacturers would make it a Dutch oven. Almost everybody else calls it a Dutch oven. At SKILLET, we would definitely, of course, if Le Creuset says, here is your unique color of Dutch oven or French ovens to sell, we would go, great, we will call it a French oven, Le Creuset, whatever you want. That is the name of the product, is a French oven, we will call it a French oven. But customers tended to want Dutch ovens, even when they are looking for Le Creuset Dutch ovens. They would specify Le Creuset Dutch oven 4 times as often or more than Le Creuset French oven, as it says here. So one solution that we had to do there was to make sure that when people were looking for Dutch ovens, they were finding the Le Creuset French ovens, because Le Creuset was one of our favorite vendor partners. Certainly one of people who come to Sur La Table love Le Creuset. It's the #1 brand at the store. If anybody has been able to afford any, it's great. I have used my employee discount to buy several pieces. I no longer have that employee discount, so I have not gotten any new Le Creuset recently, but it's really good stuff. I will note, when I was putting this talk together last month for Confab, I noticed that Le Creuset actually appears to have caved to popular opinion, and now on their own site calls everything Dutch ovens. And I don't have any insider knowledge on that, but I would assume that's because they were not getting much traction calling them French ovens out in the regular world. One other thing I noticed, another example from when I was there, just things that we sold. If you want to serve salt at your table, the fancy kind of salt, like either sea salt or maybe kosher salt, and you're not trying to put it in a shaker because sea salt and fancy kosher salt does not fit through a shaker most of the times. What do you call that little bowl of salt? Salt cellar. Anybody else? Any others? Little bowl. Probably some people did. We had people searching for things called salt pigs, salt boxes, salt cellars, salt keepers, salt containers. Different manufacturers use different terms for things that were functionally the same as a open or closed, but some kind of jar that you could take pinches of salt out. The most popular one from our customer's perspective was, in fact, a salt cellar. There you go. Good job. But if you actually looked at our site for a salt cellar, we sold 0. Which is not to say we didn't sell them. We had no products that we called salt cellar because none of the manufacturers were actually using that as their term. So that was one of those things where we had to kind of dig in and go, all right, what is a salt cellar? What does this mean? A salt cellar, manufacturers don't really agree. Same people, like some people would call basically the same thing a salt pig. Some would call it a salt box. Some would call it a salt keeper. It's really dictionaries. You looked up in different dictionaries what a salt, the definitions of these things, they're basically the same thing. It's basically salty anarchy or a salinarchy or a salarchy, depending on which way you want to go with your Latin. And these were all very interesting problems. None of them individually were giant problems, except maybe the Dutch oven problem because it was affecting Le Creuset sales. But one thing that was really important was figuring out not just what terms we used for stuff, because I did early on, and we'll talk more about style guides later, I did early on in my career at Sur La Table say, hey, people working on the web, we need to actually do a copy style guide, which they'd never really had before. They had things that they consulted, but it had never been codified. Yes, we just use Turner for these things and not spatulas or whatever else. But that was one of the things that I noticed early on was with the spatulas and Turners, for example, I always called those things spatulas. Almost everybody I knew called those things spatulas. I didn't know what we were calling a Turner, but that didn't, whatever. And we can call it a Turner, I don't care, that was fine. But how do we identify these as problems? How do I start figuring out that these were what words people used? Whoops, I went backwards. One thing was when I noticed stuff like that, looking in things like dictionaries and thesauruses and just going, if I look up a spatula, what's in there? And if you can start with your basic OED, you can do your Merriam-Webster, you can do whatever kind of dictionary that you want, more specialized cooking things. What's the difference between a bain-marie and a double boiler? And I no longer remember what the difference is, but they're functionally pretty much the same thing if you look them up. Then I went looking for stuff like slang dictionaries, which are, if people have probably used them, but get more specialized. You can even do some exciting like online slang dictionaries where things like Dutch oven have a different meaning in places like Urban Dictionary than they would, but it's still a useful thing to know. Subject matter books about the subject in particular. We found at Sur La Table, or I found in particular, that like the America's Test Kitchen books that would have glossaries on what to call these things in your kitchen, or Mark Bittman's books about things, were really, really handy things to have when figuring out what people were probably going to be calling that stuff. If people are looking at Mark Bittman's How to Cook Everything, and that's the most popular cookbook, and he calls this a salt cellar, then you probably want to make sure that you're using the term salt cellar internally. That was one of those things we picked up on. For what we was working with food related stuff and cooking related stuff, since people cook all over the place and have done it for a really long time, I was able to use stuff like more specialized things like the Dictionary of American Regional English, which would get into, hey, here in the South, we call these pans spiders, which usually means that they have a leg, but sometimes they just mean a skillet, and I don't know, whatever, I was like, great, we need to make sure that people looking for spiders don't only find Halloween spiders, that's fine. There was a lot of stuff like that looking up in there. Even going into the granddaddy of kind of the figuring out what people say wherever they're coming from, the Harvard Dialect Survey, which I don't know, do you remember a couple of years ago the New York Times ran that answer a few questions and we'll tell you where you probably grew up? That was based on questions from the Harvard Dialect Survey. So we sold glasses that you could use for pop or for soda, whichever one you wanted to call them. If you want to call it pop, be my guest. Soda is the correct term. No, because I'm from soda country, but whatever works for you. We wanted to sell it to you whichever way it went. If you want to use that spatula, that nice thin spatula for putting stuff on cupcakes, you might call it frosting, you might call it icing, you might be a baker and have a very definite opinion on which of these is the correct. These are two different things that go on two different kinds of foods and are made in two different kinds of recipes. I'm not going to tell you that you are wrong because you are totally right. But I can tell you that people in general, especially as you go around the country, some people call it all frosting, a few people call it all icing. They're definitely not as consistent as subject matter experts would necessarily like them to be. So when I was thinking about this and putting this together and the stuff that I did, there are actually, no matter where, I mean, you know, frosting versus icing is really nice, very valuable for Sur La Table, Williams-Sonoma, probably even Amazon to know. If you're not one of those people that sell stuff that people cook with, are there things you can do more generally to figure out those conflicting vocabulary areas with people? Can you get more specific? Well, sure. One of the most valuable tools I used at Sur La Table in figuring this stuff out was internal search data, which was, for a variety of reasons, harder to come by earlier in my time, ended up becoming easier, but once we actually turned that on and were able to see this is what people are actually searching for, it was kind of a goldmine. You could see that's exactly how I found out at some point that most people were saying, like, that, not just as I suspected, most people called them spatulas, but, you know, spatula was a top 20 search term where Turner was, not that nobody searched for Turners, but maybe a 10th or a 20th as popular as that. So that was switching over to Google Analytics. I know you can do this with other analytics programs, but Google Analytics was the one that we turned on. It made this much, much easier. As I said, that is where I got the spatula data. One of the other really important things to do in general was to start listening to users, and not just listening to users tell you what they are doing and what they're saying, but like literally listen to the words that people are using who are visiting the site about what it is that they are looking for or what that they want to find or what they didn't find, which is a really not good scenario, but certainly happens a lot. And we had a lot of channels for that, where if we started paying attention to them, we could pull that out. And these, I think, are true for a lot of different places, a lot of different industries. We used a lot of user surveys. In particular, we had those user surveys that pop up and ask you to rate a whole bunch of interactions on a scale of 1 to 10. I don't like that particular survey. It was not my call, but I did love that they had a box that people would use to fill in. It was like, what other problems did you have, or what else were you looking for? What did you look for that you couldn't find? And there was a report on that you could go into. You could look at it daily, regularly, but find out. People would say, you know, oh, I was looking for this and I couldn't find it. I was looking for a Dutch oven or whatever it was that I could or couldn't find. And you could read. I mean, we had a volume that was decent enough that you could find patterns, but not so overwhelming that you couldn't look at them all. So I could actually read all of the comments and skim them. But you could also dump them into things and look for patterns in spreadsheets and stuff like that. Reading the customer reviews people left on products was also really handy, because even on a product called a French oven, people would call it a Dutch oven in running copy, for example. So that was one of the things that demonstrated not just that it's not that people didn't know what they were getting, but that they would use the word Dutch oven to talk about something that had been sold to them and came in a box that said French oven on it. We would get email, of course, at customer service. We would get email from customer service themselves talking about phone calls that they had, or problems that people had on the website, and listening to that. And they would usually, I mean, customer service was really good. They would usually be able to say, yeah, I ran the search too, I couldn't find it, or, you know, I told them they had to look for X or Y, but passing that along was really handy. One of the other really valuable places to go, and they're a little less common, but usability sessions are a great place to just watch people. I mean, I assume many people here have done usability or seen some of it done, but just being able to sit in the room and listen to people talk about what they're doing and the words, not just like, oh, they can't find this button, but the words that they're using to describe what they're doing or how they're looking for can be really enlightening. I will tell you the story of, this ties back to the spatula and turner problem, which when I first started, a lot of people didn't even think was a problem. I mean, people internally were kind of like, yeah, people call them spatulas, but we call them turners, and they're fine. It's great, turner, whatever. Yeah, it's kind of weird, whatever. We had a usability session going because we were redoing the site navigation for our site. And that meant that people were actually having to not use the search box and specifically go try to use our navigation and figure things out. And one of the things that we had people do was, hey, if you were shopping at Sur La Table, what is it that you would be buying? And one was like, I would look for a spatula. And she went dutifully through the little tree, found Cook's tools, great. She found the right spot, found spatulas, went to this page full of spatulas, and she found a page that was full of things that you would use to spread on cupcakes and do other stuff. And she's like, I want to flip over pancakes. Maybe she wanted to do burgers. I don't remember. Anyway, she wanted a turn-over spatula, not a spread-around spatula. And she literally sat there for 5 minutes going, I don't understand. I know they sell them. I don't understand why they're not here. It was made a little worse, and this was obviously usability where somebody's going to spend 5 minutes, because in the real world, nobody was going to spend 5 minutes sitting there going, I don't understand why these things aren't spatulas. But we actually had, just because the way somebody had made a little error in merchandising the page, which happened, and so there were like 2 out of 20 things that were actually what she was looking for, the turnover kind of spatulas, but they were both like for grilling and really expensive. So they were not what she was looking for either. But like I said, literally 5 minutes. I actually timed this because I wanted to make sure I wasn't exaggerating. And the one thing she never did in this entire session was say, I bet they call them turners, or even I bet they call them flippers. She was looking for a spatula. She found spatulas. I think she might have talked a little bit about, yeah, these are spatulas, but they're not the spatulas I'm looking for, so whatever. And this was great. I mean, I felt really bad for this woman, but this was great because I was right. And it was like this real, total, open the vault at the end of Die Hard, play Ode to Joy moment, where I actually could point to someone, we had it on video, and go, look, when we are calling these things turners, and people are coming here calling them spatulas, we are clearly driving them bananas, or we're just not getting the sale, which, at some point, that's the same difference. They're leaving and going, I'll go to Williams-Sonoma or Target. Miserable customers, they got really compelling arguments. So that was where it really turned into we need to identify, James, go find all of these terms that you are talking about, blah, 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 and figure out how we can actually make sure that when someone's looking for a spatula, they will find a spatula. Also, could you verify that more people are looking for spatulas than turners? Yes, here's my internal search data. So that would be great. So that was a problem to solve. And each of them, of course, is a slightly unique problem. What we did in that particular circumstance was, one thing we did was combine categories so that spatulas and turners live together. There is a category under Cook's Tools now called spatulas and turners. This bothers nobody except a few people internally at the start of it who were like, they're different things. And you're like, it doesn't matter. And we actually had usability sessions after doing that, and people had no problem with the fact that they were all living, because everyone was happy to call them spatulas for the most part. Internal search, that was something that we were able to play with and work on, because we used Endeca. I don't know who uses what for their internal search stuff. I can't tell you all of the super complicated things about how internal search works, but I can tell you that I learned how to play with the thesaurus and the synonym matching engine within that, so that when people were looking for things that matched other things, they would find what they were looking for. So one thing we would do at that point was try searching for words that are synonyms. For us, it was like stuff like, if you're looking for a skillet or you're looking for a frying pan, they're the same thing. Are you turning up the same products for both of those searches? And especially at the beginning when people hadn't been paying attention to this at all, the answer was no. You would get, with skillets and frying pans, we actually wasn't really a consensus. So you'd get just an entirely different set of products for skillets and entirely different. They were all good because we sold them. They were nice, but they were not. If you were looking for one particular brand, you might not see that or whatever else. So tinkering with the thesaurus on that one was easy. You could just go, when people search for skillets, let that equal frying pan, or vice versa. So either one of those would basically pull up the same search results, because as far as the internal search engine was concerned, frying pan was the same thing as skillet. You may have already thought ahead on this, but spatulas and turners and flippers are slightly more complicated, because a spatula equals a turner, but turner doesn't always equal spatula. If somebody's actually searching for a turner, they want the pancake flipper. They definitely don't want the bowl scrape thingy. If they're searching for a flipper, they want the thing that turns over pancakes. What we had to do with that one was actually set it up so that when you searched for a spatula, you would get turners, but when you search for turners or flippers, you would only get the things that were called turners and turn those up. So those all were positive sorts of things. They drove a better experience just by tweaking around with copy and the way that we worked with that internally. People have asked about it, and I was not directly in charge of SEO efforts on these pages. So I can't go into, I just don't have a lot of detail on how, like, if there is one word try, like with skillet and frying pan, I don't really know if either of those actually ranks better, or if you need to, like, you don't need to stuff your copy with anything. But if you need to try to, like, balance those, but it was one of those things where we could pass along this information about frequency to the copywriters and make sure that they were at least aware that these things were out there. In my experience with stuff like frying pans and skillets, Google is much better at identifying the fact that people consider them the same thing. Not 100% of the time, but way better than our internal default off-the-shelf search engine was doing originally. I mentioned earlier, who among you has worked on a copy style guide? Like actually worked on creating, yeah, lots of us. And it's fun. I've set up and helped manage a couple of style guides. They're great. They are essential, but as demonstrated earlier, good luck telling your users which words to use for anything. Your style guide works for you entirely. We were very consistent about calling things turners. It would not have, I don't think a massive, I think if we had bothered to do a massive education campaign on what to call the things that you turn over your pancakes with, I don't think it would have changed anybody's opinions one iota, and we certainly didn't have the staff for that. You also have to watch out for, with stuff like that, how to spell things. For example, this is where it gets back to testing your internal search engine, because Google is really good at this, but internal stuff isn't always. We had, for example, pad thai recipes. I've always seen it spelled P-A-D-T-H-A-I, especially in edited copy, maybe on a couple restaurant menus, P-H-A-D. We had a class that taught Thai cooking, and the recipe was spelled P-H-A-D-T-H-A-I because the person that got the recipe got it from a restaurant where it had been spelled PH in Thailand. So they were like, this is the way it's spelled. We don't care if you can show us 4 dictionaries and 2 other things that say it should be spelled this way. We're spelling it this way. And it's like, well, but people don't type. Like, if you look for how many people are looking for this, the ratio of PAD Thai to this is really overwhelming. But okay, we can set up the internal thesaurus so that it returns the correct thing. The people who are looking to learn how to make pad thai or looking for a utensil to use with pad thai can actually find the correct spelling, even though we want to spell it funky. It is good to figure out your own voice like that. And again, I'm happy to let somebody who found this recipe and created the recipe decide what to name it. In a perfect universe, I could have just overruled them and said, no, the human world and Merriam-Webster say that this is PAT. But it doesn't happen, but that's fine. You don't need to worry about changing what your customers do. So one tip on that and finding that sort of stuff is to look for those instances of contested words or insider knowledge. It's possible. I mean, people do call it a turner. People do call them flippers. Turner is sort of an example of industry jargon. People aren't confused by it. It's not totally meaningless fluff jargon that nobody's ever heard of before. But it's clearly, when we were using it, was something that, we were doing it because the industry was doing it. That's how they like to say it. So we will call them turners, and didn't have strong opinions ourselves on that. But that was kind of insider knowledge. And if you paid attention to that and weren't somebody working in merchandising or working on that side of the industry, you might be a little more noted for that. But actually putting together the style guide is a great place to look for contested words, because almost any time that you have a discussion about which term to use, what are we going to call this thing? What is the official term that we use for this? If you are having that discussion and it's hard to come up with an answer, that means that there are probably people out there who are looking to you who are thinking of the other term that you have said is not your official term. And that doesn't mean you have to therefore use them interchangeably or violate your own style, but you want to do what you can to make sure that those people are not just left out in the cold because they don't know which one that you've picked. One example of that more recently, when I worked at Substance and did work for Travel Oregon, which is the Oregon tourism website, in case anybody here is not familiar with it, which you should all be. But they had things called attractions, they had a bunch of stuff called trip ideas, they had a bunch of stuff called see and do, they even had things called itineraries, and that was one of those things where I came in and was like, I don't see a hard and fast distinction between all of these things. I mean, I can guess from context what a lot of these were doing and saying, but when they decided to redesign their website, we actually ran a usability session and taxonomy on that, and specifically asked people as they were doing all this, do these terms mean different things to you? And some people thought that they all three meant completely different things, and some people thought they all meant basically the same thing, and some people thought that two of them meant the same thing and one of them was completely something different. And nobody overall agreed on exactly what those distinctions were. So people were happy to make distinctions, but they weren't happy to go like, there was not some universal definition that they were going with. For example, attractions. There were several people that would say attractions are definitely man-made things like an amusement park, that's an attraction. And there were people who would say attractions are definitely things like Mount Hood, these big natural wonder attraction sorts of things. Those are kind of incompatible opinions, and there's not really a right answer even with that, but it was let's make sure that we are careful with what we are calling these things, and in the end, reduce the number of these sorts of vaguely synonymous terms that we're using in navigation to help people get to what they're looking for. So that was a case of going in and simplifying a bit and making sure that off the top of my head, don't remember what I think we got rid of trip ideas, and attractions and see and do are both there in the upcoming change stuff. I like to call this, now that I had been thinking about it a lot, a vocabulary audit as part of the overall content audit, content thing. Just note the vocabulary they're using. And it's a little bit different from a style guide, although I think that the style guide can be a thing that you use to prompt it. But again, making note of cases where we've had, these are terms that are confusing to people. These are terms that seem synonymous and people don't have a hard and fast definition. These are terms that are literally synonymous and we only use one of them, but we want to make sure that people don't not know the other one. Decide on the terms that you will use in-house, but don't expect customers to know or use them themselves, even with a certain amount of education. And if you are e-commerce like us, you don't necessarily want to spend a ton of time doing customer education. Although, I do have to say, for people who are into the content marketing side of things, one of the most popular blog posts we ever wrote was, what is the difference between a spatula and a turner and a flipper? Which got, and still gets, because the last I checked with people that are still there, still gets, on any given day, assuming that it's not being promoted, I think the highest natural search term results for us on that one. Because a lot of people out there are clearly interested in that question, or enough people are interested in that question. One of the other, really, this is not a vocabulary thing, but one of the other most popular things, showing that people like to know how to do stuff, was how do you pronounce sur la table? So when we did a blog post on that, that gets tons of stuff. And you pronounce it usually like me, sur la table, not sur la table. We will not kick you out. But sur la table, which we had some people doing internally, is that you don't have to go that fancy. That's fine. Fulfill the spirit of people's inquiries and not just the letter of their inquiries. When they want to know what something is or when they're looking for something, don't make them guess what your terms are for that. Make sure that you are aware that they might be looking for something similar, related, different. I do have another story for you, and it comes out of a different usability session about 2 years after the first one that I went to with the spatulas and turners. And this is just a case of, the moral of the story is be aware again of what people are saying and how they are using these terms. Same exercise. We had somebody come in and look through our site and see what do you want to buy? What would be something you would shop for at Sur La Table? And a woman said a hand mixer. We have hand mixers, great. So she looked for hand mixers. She was able to use search, so that was exciting. And she found this. She found a hand mixer. It's not what she wanted. And we were actually all kind of taken aback because I was like, that's a hand mixer. I don't know what that is. Oops, sorry. She was actually looking for one of these, which we called an immersion blender. Or people call them wand blenders or stick blenders or hand blenders. They're actually different things. I mean, this is more of a, unlike spatulas and turners, where those are really valid, equally valid terms for all of those things. Turner is not the right term for the thing you use to flip over your pancakes. Just what, if you go get Joseph to make one for you, they will probably call it a turner. This is more the right term for this tool because a mixer does something fundamentally different than a blender, although not so fundamentally different that you can't understand why people wouldn't make this mistake. Regardless, we ended up making sure that people looking for hand mixers, and we actually found this to be true, like double checking on Google is like, oh, you image search for hand mixer and you get a lot of these, but you get some of these. So people clearly are not 100% labeling all these correctly. And this is something that it's not something I would have guessed. As soon as I saw it, it made sense, but it was not I can think my way into this problem. And this is a listen to what people are saying. So this is one where with the search thesaurus, it was immersion blender, stick blender, hand blender, and wand blender all equal the same thing, but hand mixer can also mean that thing just because other people do that. And people, when they're looking for an immersion blender, are definitely not looking for this. So they get that distinction. If you need to buy one, I recommend the blender, but that's just me. Learn your customer's language. Pay attention to what they're doing. One of the reasons to do this is, I don't know if this is true for you, but we didn't have tons of editorial resources to spend copy editing and proofing everything. Some people probably still do, but that's a discipline under siege. And one reason that you are editing anything in the first place is to avoid confusing your readers. It is good UX. Good editors know this. It make copy edited prose as easier to read. But if you are only going off of a style guide or best practices or stuff like that without really digging into it, you're just leaning on best practices. They're no match for good blast at your side because best practices are kind of like the thing of last resort in my experience. They can be a good thing to do, but they are like folk wisdom. Better than no wisdom whatsoever, but they're not exactly the same thing as an actual study or proof that things are or aren't working as you would like them to do. And if you have scarce editorial resources, and some of these things that we know of as best practices don't actually improve things, why spend time editing them? I don't have infinite time to do that. Nobody I know has infinite time to do that. Not since the glory days of newspapers when they were able to do stuff like hunt down widows and orphans in their copy. And for those of you who have not been around a very long time, widows and orphans are the little one-word danglers at the beginning or end of paragraphs. And copy editors would spend a lot of time making sure that they could re-edit the copy so that those would disappear because those were thought to impede reading. Those are not the right kind of widows and orphans. But as it turns out, when people did studies of readability looking at newspaper copy that had not been edited for this and just left them sitting there, eliminating widows and orphans was a waste of copy editors' time. And when they had a ton of time to spend on that, you could spend a lot of time arguing about whether they were good or bad or indifferent. But gentlemen at the Detroit Free Press tried this and found zero impact on legibility. As John McIntyre, who's the copy editor for the Baltimore Sun, said, not Boston, no reader had any problem with bad breaks, and we had been laboring on an imaginary improvement. One other sort of change, this is probably a little closer to home for some of us. I mean, widows and orphans, it seems outdated, but I have had, as a copywriter, within the last few years, designers ask me to edit copy because it just wasn't laying out right on the page. And at some point you're like, that is not a valid reason to be spending a lot of time editing copy just because you don't like that this one word went over here or whatever else, especially when, as we know, if it's a truly responsive design, you're not going to be able to dictate all that stuff anyway. But, and most people get it, some people still don't, few people. A more common thing, or more up-to-date contemporary thing, was a couple of years ago when the AP Stylebook changed their rule on over versus more than, which is they said that over and more than meant the same thing, which in practical English they did. If you could say there are over 20 people in this room, you could say there are more than 20 people in this room. In general talking, both of those are fine. In AP Style, until a couple of years ago, if you said there are over 20 people in this room, that would be corrected to there are more than 20 people in this room. There were a lot of tweets about that one when they announced it, because there are a lot of people who were convinced that that was an inviolate rule of grammar. It is not an inviolate rule of grammar. It is a bogus rule. If you do any research into it, experts say it's fine. Readers aren't confused. It actually came about because of a pet peeve of a newspaper editor in the late 19th century who was just like, I don't like it when you do this. Do it this way. So, okay, we will do that. We will codify it in a style book and we'll make people spend time changing all of that. And we had tons and tons of money and we were flush in 1983. That was a valuable use of time. I don't know if you want to spend your time doing that now. When reader confusion is not an issue, I would not spend a lot of time on that particular changes. Although if is harder for you to not change that, it's not like it hurts you to leave it alone either. Why spend time making edits that don't matter to users? You want to spend time on your details that matter, which includes spending time on figuring out which details those are. Things like the Oxford comma. Everybody here has a passionate opinion. Well, maybe not everybody. Most people here probably have a passionate opinion about the Oxford comma, one way or the other. I have a strong personal preference regarding the Oxford comma, which I will not reveal, because fundamentally, what I care about is clarity. And the thing about the Oxford comma is it's really fun to argue about because it makes no difference most of the time. That's not to say that it never makes a difference, but those are the times when you should edit for clarity regardless and just use common sense. And even the AP Style Guide, which does not like the Oxford comma, says if it's going to be confusing, please use a comma. Copy editing, fundamentally, I would argue, is a UX discipline. It is there to make experiences better for people who are experiencing your text. In many circumstances, the right word actually pays off in value. When we changed the internal search thesaurus and made it so that people looking for Dutch ovens would find French ovens, or when we changed it so that people looking for spatulas would find turners, it was not, I'm not going to over-exaggerate exactly how much it is, but these improve the bottom line a little bit, each one of them, because people were actually finding what they were looking for. You know, not so many people are searching for spatulas and turners that we doubled the amount of revenue that we were making at the company or anything like that, but we were definitely seeing lower cart abandonment, or lower, not cart abandonment, but lower abandonment of the site because people were actually finding what they were looking for. And that is basically it. I am totally open to questions if anybody has any, or commentary or anything like that. And I will start with you. The first hand raised, yes.
Well, just because of what you just said toward the end, that was my question that has been rising up is, were you able to tie this? It's a hard thing to tie to ROI, but surely, are you able to define some KPIs that show that for specific products you are getting increased revenue?
We were not able to do it. I mean, like you said, it's a little nebulous just because it's about 2 steps removed from the, I mean, the great thing about e-commerce is that you have really hard and fast metrics. The complicated thing is that if your thing is not directly generating, they bought this, it's a little bit harder to say. But we did notice with things that I tracked, like I said, with like the Dutch oven, French oven, or specifically with stuff like Salt Cellar was an easy one to go, look, we made a difference on this because we actually had revenue associated with each individual search term, and that went way up with Salt Cellar because it used to be 0 because people searching for salt, or all close to 0 because people searching for salt cellars would literally not find anything. It wasn't a sophisticated enough search engine at the time to go, we will throw things up that say salt. It was like, we don't have salt cellar, so no. Or things like spatulas and turners, that average value of those internal keyword. And this is not, to be really clear, this is not external AdWords. This is internally, those would go up a bit because we had changed that. Stuff like French oven, Dutch oven would also go up a little bit. So it definitely was not a like, oh yes, we did this and made $400 this quarter, but we could give an indication, yes.
How did you collect data from the customer service folks, other than they just got off the phone when you walked in and say, oh, they're asking for turners again, but did they have some way of collecting hard data for you across the terminology set?
Sadly, no. I mean, they did not. They actually worked, they were in Indiana, based in Bloomington. We were in Seattle. They did, so that tended to be something that got better as time went on because they would occasionally surface stuff and eventually you'd hear about it over on the web team because somebody yelled loud enough or whatever. I mean, it was one of those, or it was a bad enough experience that the customer service person didn't just walk them through and go, oh yes, we found you this double boiler. They actually said, oh, I tried this search and I couldn't find it. You guys should maybe think about fixing this. So that was kind of where it was at first, and you would just hear about the really awkward ones or the really unfortunate ones. But as time went on, we were able to get, and talk to them and go, hey, this was an easy problem to solve. You would get more of that. There wasn't really, if I were still there, that would be one of the things I would like to do, is kind of do a more formal, weekly report, monthly report, whatever they're comfortable doing. It's hard because they are like completely a different chain of reporting, and so their time is not, it would be nice if you could spend some time compiling these things and sending it to us, as opposed to you're just obligated to do that as part of it. One thing that did help and started working on was that they, Sir Latab instituted the pop-up online chat help sort of stuff. So if you were on the site, I mean, I personally find them annoying, but they work, so whatever. But we could get transcripts of all of those, so that was actually something that we could just go and access ourselves. But alas, I do not have this was a great solution that got stuff all the time. But they tended to make things known, but it was just not a formal system, unfortunately. Yes?
Could you repeat the question so that we can...
Yes, sorry, I should do that.
Thank you.
Okay. If there are more, yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, so as you've taken this experience to new places, how receptive do you find people are to kind of your ideas about vocabulary audits and kind of user-centered language?
That is a good question. That was basically when I have gone to places after SKILLET, how receptive are people to the concept of paying attention to this and the idea of vocabulary audits. I will confess that I thought of the term vocabulary audits when I was doing this presentation, so I have not said I can deliver you a vocabulary audit to anybody in person, but I do like the sound of it, and people like that. But like when I went to, when I was working at Substance, which is where I worked after SKILLET, and just paying attention to that, it's a little bit of, there was less pushback there. I mean, at SKILLET, it's just an older company. They've done things the way they do them for a long time. So there was a lot more like, yeah, turners are turners, and that's what we call them, and don't worry about it. And until you can actually go, hey, we have this thing. Where with people who are building web stuff all the time, it was easy for me to go, I am looking at this site that I am new to, and I don't understand what the difference is between itinerary and see and do, for example. Like these don't, like I can guess, but these are not to me. And have you heard anything about that? No, but they were, I mean, that was one where they were very open to asking that question on surveys that they were doing. So with that, which is that's the bulk of the work I've done since then, that went over fine. I mean, I think honestly, not a lot of people think about word choice to that extent, to that, onto that granular level all the time. So you can have some pretty great designers and stuff working on stuff that aren't necessarily paying attention to exactly when a particular word is going to stop or hinder somebody. But they were certainly open to it, and it really helped clarify a lot of things. I mean, like when we redesigned the Travel Oregon navigation, it really led us to be able to simplify things like that and make it less confusing overall, as demonstrated in both testing and dev stuff. So, yes?
I have another question about vocabulary audits.
Sure, go.
How do you go about determining how broad or how narrow categories should be? If you have a ton of terms, you want to kind of narrow things down. How do you decide how broad is useful for the users and how broad is overwhelming?
Sure. Did everybody hear that, or I need to try to repeat that question, which was a good question? That was basically when doing stuff like vocabulary audits, how do you decide from a user perspective, what is too broad and what is too narrow? Is that basically?
Yeah, how many terms are too many?
Okay.
How many are helpful and how many are too many?
How many terms are helpful? How many are too many? Some of that is context. I mean, in your search thesaurus, if you're able to play around with that, nobody sees that, so you can dump as many synonyms for something in there as you want to, and it doesn't mean you want to test them and make sure they're not somehow, you could set things up to be pretty gnarly if you accidentally cross-reference stuff, but regardless, you can do as many synonyms and stuff as you want because they're not public facing. With things like navigation, I mean, the basic answer is testing the nav structure with that sort of thing. So at SKILLET, we actually ended up testing that more, not totally live, but a dev actually worked up a working version of a taxonomy that we had put together with using card sorts and using groupings. And that in SKILLET, it was a really big question because they sell tons of different products, and what is the best grouping for those? We were trying to push, when I started doing that taxonomy project, they had, I don't want to get this wrong, I want to say they had 8 buckets. We pushed down to, in testing, 4 based on user feedback and stuff like that. And then once we had some internal discussion and some actual live testing that wasn't just live, we went up to 5, I want to say. So it was simpler, but not crazy simpler. And with Travel Oregon, we were actually able to do more, like actually do a tree sort exercise I used Optimal Workshop and set up stuff and said, do an online card sort and throw the stuff in buckets. And people were actually pretty happy to bring that down from, I don't remember what they were at, but we ended up with 3 in the proposed design for the higher level. And I think that was the other thing is people are happy, in my experience at least, people are happy to drill down multiple levels as long as they feel like they're making progress. They're not necessarily happy to spend 5 minutes trying to figure out from 9 different main category things where to go, or I went into this one and it's not there, so whatever. In my experience generally, with navigation especially, starting broad but with few terms and letting people drill down was more effective than trying to go broad right from the start and getting people there faster. Just because unless you have very, very clear distinctions between things, people would spend a lot of time guessing. An example of that from Sur La Table was that we sell aprons, and our top level navigation is cooking, baking, coffee and tea. It's been a while, so there were 2 more, household, stuff like that. And aprons honestly fit, and we had evidence of this from people sorting them in almost all of those categories equally, which was solved by basically letting people get to aprons through all of those areas if they wanted to. That's a case where there isn't one correct spot, and this is the spot that everybody acknowledges is the correct spot, and you will not confuse people if you go with that. Does that answer the question that you're looking for? Or are there more I can say? Okay.
I can talk to you after.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Yes.
Not so much a question, but have you been presented with or thought about the coming chatbot conversation UI storm? And how does that change this? How does vocabulary audit fit into somebody is asking chat, like spatula?
So the question was, phrase was caveated that it's not necessarily a question, but it was kind of a question. With the coming chatbots, interfaces, that sort of UI, basically, how does vocabulary audits and this kind of idea fit with that? Is that a decent summary? Okay. Not directly, although, like I said, we instituted live chat at Sur La Table before I was done there, but that was actually live chat. There's a boilerplate thing that pops up, but if you actually engage, you're actually engaging with somebody, and they don't serve it if there's nobody there to do that, so it's not quite the same. I haven't worked on it. I have not worked on it directly. I've certainly kept abreast of a lot of the good skeptical approaches to that, and it's in some ways like the hard part with the chat UI, that sort of interface, is less the terminology. Like I said, we used Turner for spatula, and people were not really confused by us saying, look, here's all these Turners. If you would actually show them a picture of what they're looking for, it was when they were going, I'm trying to find a spatula and not able to find it. So from that perspective, I think it's fine. The chat bot and that sort of scripted stuff gets really tricky when you are trying to infuse a lot of personality into something that's not, as a human, you are in a conversation with somebody and you know when they are stressed out, or you know when they are upset, or you know when they're open to being funny. Ideally, if you're good at talking to people. And an AI or that kind of chatbot UI, not an AI because it's not that smart, but doesn't know that. So that's, as much of a vocabulary audit, I think that's as much a voice and tone sort of thing, and when is it appropriate to be bringing those out? Because I've certainly seen, the articles on the really bad experiences of that. I have myself been searching for somebody at 2 a.m. looking for an overnight pharmacy, and had the pharmacy website, this is not a chatbot, but the pharmacy website go, do you want to take a survey about your experience? And I'm like, no, I just want to know where the damn, pharmacy is. Don't ask me. I'm looking for a 24-hour pharmacy at 2 a.m. I think now is not the time that you want me to do usability surveys on your website on mobile. So I think that there's a lot to be said for that, but I think that that's guided as much or more so by voice and tone considerations first, and then the vocabulary use can filter out from that. But without having worked on it directly, it's hard for me to say, yes, this is the way to do it. Any other questions? Yeah.
From some of the different search engines and the search types that you work with, there's generally two types. There's like the open kind of search where you do a keyword or whatever and then get the results. And the other one's kind of type ahead where you would type something and then it would render categorized faceted search, select that given that it's there in the data set. What's your kind of opinions on like kind of open search versus the type ahead approach?
So the question was about opinions about working with internal search that is compare and contrast open field search, which is like you have the box and you type it in and go, or type ahead that actually starts prompting you with category distinctions. I think, so I can say specifically at Sur La Table, we tried playing around with type ahead search, which didn't actually, I mean, it had its advantages, but it didn't really move any metrics for us that we cared about. So it was not like, oh, this was a terrible idea, but it was also, oh, we are slowing down some things and it's not really panning out as a great idea, so how can we make it better? But it was also not the most sophisticated version where like this would not, even with the search thesaurus, if you'd started typing SPAT, it's not gonna start going, oh, and here's Turner down here. You know, it was literally, we will find you, if you are spelling it correctly, we will find you the thing that you were looking for. So I think that might have been something that would keep it from being, you know, as effective as possible. I mean, I've certainly looked at, like Baymard Institute does a lot of UX best practices for e-commerce, and they have recommendations on that make sense and seem to bear out, but that's one of those situations where it feels, I mean, at least with our experience, it was, test it and see if it works. And then we also had people wanting to do visual stuff in there, so you would see things coming up like pictures. And again, I think that's a fine idea, but it was not really producing anything for us in that regard. I do think that can help stuff like spelling errors fairly well. Like if you start typing, I mean, that's another one where if you'd started typing pod thai with an H, it would have dropped that right after the H, so, and probably not have gotten there with just the P because it doesn't usually start for a couple of letters, but maybe. I think that would work. I mean, I like that as a concept. In my experience, it has not been a groundbreaking, it's not been a disaster by any means, but it hasn't been groundbreaking results from that either. I'm going to go to someone who's not asked a question. Yes?
I was wondering if you took into account people who speak English as a second language, and if so, what did you find?
The question was whether I took into account people who spoke English as a second language, and if so, what did I find? The really short answer to that is no. I mean, not specifically. Mostly, I mean, there was not any particular reason. I want to say, at least in the usability sessions, we had at least a couple people who were, I mean, like, we did not specifically ask, but indicated that they were ESL. And I mean, with those, they just weren't that distinct from what other people were doing. So that certainly might change depending on what the first language was, like how you would think of different items, or maybe how you would spell stuff. But it just didn't come up as a specific audience that needed to be teased out for separate consideration at that point. But I think it's a really interesting question, and if it had been different products or different target audiences in a lot of ways, I think that would be something that would be really useful to look into. That's where actually that type ahead sort of stuff would be especially useful, I suspect. Did you have a question, Marcia? Yes.
What would a template look like for a vocabulary audit?
What would a template look like for a vocabulary audit? I actually, I would have to make one. So, but I, in my head, and what I've poked around with, it would look an awful lot like a style guide with just extra stuff. You know, you could spreadsheet it if you want to, or even just adding things to the style guide to note that, you know, this is a term that we use, you know, that is commonly used. I mean, that's how we did stuff informally. I mean, when I was not calling it a vocabulary audit and was just kind of throwing that stuff out there, it was the kind of handy information that I would be able to go, hey, copywriters, you know, like people use skillet 60% of the time instead of frying pan, but, you know, whatever, this is a good thing to know. Or you should probably call them spatulas and running copy when you can get away with it, because that is what people are looking for. I don't know if you'd... Yeah, I think dictionary-like, because the people that are going to be using it, it's going to be, I think it would be hard to make it programmatic. And I think that it does have a lot of implications on even if you choose a style that might not go with that, a style that explicitly says this word is not in our style or this phrase is not in our style, it's good to know that that phrase is out there and that people will be looking for it. Like one that we did, actually, we had recipes for, now I'm not going to remember what they ended up being called, but for Irish car bomb cupcakes, which is actually a really popular recipe type, but it's not the most sensitive term for a cupcake. I mean, we didn't invent it, but people were kind of like, let's do Irish car bomb cupcakes, and it was like, let's call them stout and whatever else is in those things. Like, we had to come up with a thing, but also that was one where it was like, all right, let's, in the internal search thing, we will call them car bomb cupcakes, as if anybody's actually looking for it. That was one where you look and it's like a bazillion searches for that and like nothing searching for really any other variant, but it's not really house style to be endorsing car bombs as fun. So for a lot of places, I think, not just Sur La Table, yeah. That was one of those where you kind of think, at first you're like, yeah, car bomb cupcakes, and it was like, we can't say that. That's not a good thing. Even if everybody's saying that, that's not a good thing to do. There was one more hand, yes.
Kind of off your question, if you would ever autocorrect for common spelling mistakes in the search field or accommodate, say, the Queen's English and point to the same, I can't think of an example, but where.
Sure, no, that's,
But, yeah.
sorry, what was that?
Color.
Color, yeah, that was a good question. That is, with the internal search engine, do you ever do like spelling correction? And I should have actually come up with that. Yes, by the time I was done there, we actually had installed a version of that actually did it. I mean, there's an off-the-shelf version, so stuff like color, OUR versus OR is automatically done, but it will also learn common, like if you're looking for, like Le Creuset is a really popular brand that nobody can spell. So there are like, I mean, you look through our search records and you could find like 20 different ways that people would try to spell Le Creuset. And it wasn't super easy because people had tried accommodating that internally by adding misspellings, but not programmatically as acceptable alternate spellings. So that sort of messed the thesaurus up because it had a bunch of acceptable spellings. But later on, it would get to a point where you could do almost a lot of the really common variations of Le Creuset. And it would go, did you mean Le Creuset? And like the actual spelling of Le Creuset, and give them the results. And it was not an annoying message of like, you can't spell. It was just, you probably meant this because we have 400 things of this and 0 of La Creuset or whatever. So yes, I think that spelling, that is something that helps a lot when you have that and can turn that on and make it work, especially if you can nudge it in the right direction. All right.
Ken, got one.
Oh, yes.
So if it's a hand mixer, but it plugs in to the wall.
Yes.
Will you call the thing that you do this to?
We didn't sell those, so I didn't have to worry about it. But that'd be a hand mixer, yeah. That was,
That's what I'm.
yeah. That'd be an electric hand mixer versus a manual hand mixer. That was actually another thing where we actually did a blog post on hand mixer versus immersion blender, and that is another one that's really popular because.
She has the answer. It's an egg beater.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Nice. Anything else? Any others? Good. If you want to ask me afterwards, that's fine too. So I'm here. Thanks.